Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and let's talk about Sailing the Wine Dark Sea by Thomas Cahill, which is actually book 4. He wrote this series that he decided to call Hinges of History, which had to do with the foundations of Western thought, really. And the first book was How the Irish Saved Civilization, which really had to do with preserving Roman culture and Roman history and philosophy and all this kind of stuff so that it would be there when everybody got out of the doldrums of the Middle Ages and started to recover something vaguely resembling literacy. And he has a couple more books, one of which is The Gift of the Jews, which is actually on the list, but library holds stuff. Anyways, so Sailing the Wine Dark Sea, Why the Greeks Matter, is actually book 4 in this series. But this is the one I managed to get a hold of, so this is next. And so this is a book, and yeah, okay, sure. So here's the thing, before anybody, starts to accuse me of, I don't know, reading things for this rather than picking books I actually liked. Here's the thing. I reread the books right before I do the videos, and that means that if I can't get a hold of a book, then that book is just gonna be in the order that it is, unless I'm being really, really slavish about following orders, and anyways. So, here's the thing. We all know that the Greeks are a big thing in Western history. It's not something that really needs to be pointed out. It's not like Greeks aren't central, but in a way, he's revisiting the Greeks kind of as a reminder, because when we talk about that period of history, that region and the history of it, we talk about Greco-Roman history, because the Greeks and the Romans share some really startling similarities in terms of aesthetics, in terms of culture, and some of that can, of course, be seen as deriving from them both being Mediterraneans, Mediterranean peoples, and so relative geographic closeness, and so, peoples that are close together geographically tend to develop along similar lines culturally. I mean, if you consider the similarities between, say, Korean and Japanese as compared to French and German, nobody's saying the French and the German are the same, and they're not saying that the Koreans and the Japanese are the same, but the Koreans and Japanese are a lot more similar to each other in the same way that the Germans and the French are a lot more similar to each other than they are to either, Japanese or Korean. And those were picked more or less at random. But, and it's the reason why at a distance, people who don't know anything about any other family of cultures can often sort of hand wave that they're all the same, because at a distance, the similarities stand out more than the differences. This is like listening to jazz music. Because I have never really cared for the improvisatory jazz style. The thing that most of us really think of when we think of jazz, that aimless noodling on the piano. The thing is that for somebody who really loves it, they don't hear aimless noodling. They can hear infinite variations within a theme and infinite iterations and so on. But for those of us who don't particularly like it and thus don't know that much about it, it comes across as you're doing the same thing over and over again. Now you've moved a few keys up and you've done a key change and you're still doing the same thing, and please stop. And so culturally, the Greeks and Romans are a little like that. But this book posits and pushes forward this fundamental notion because the Greeks, at the height of their powers, came before the Romans. And in a way, you can see the arc of Greek culture and what happened to it just in the art. He has a series of chapters, each of which sort of detailing a different line or aspect of Greek culture that, ought to be considered. The warrior, the wanderer, the poet, politician and playwright, philosopher, and the artist. And finally, the way they went, Greco-Roman meets Judeo-Christian. And the warrior has to do with, ultimately what was the Greek influence on how people approach war, on the fact that the Roman war machine probably owes something to the fact that the Greeks developed this standardization, this organization, this thing that it isn't a bunch of warriors coming together, that these are soldiers. And that you have this example of these highly regimented, organized groups that stand as a different sort of army from what you get when you just say we are going to have all of the warriors coming together. The thing about the rest of this, though, is that this winds up in various iterations of how the Greeks thought, of the fact that they developed poetry, which apparently they didn't like rhyming poetry. They felt that rhyming in poetry was the sign of somebody who was too lazy not to, which, frankly, that comes out of a language unlike English, where rhyming is easy. It's one of those things that you note that in languages that tend to have a lot of words that end exactly the same, so that rhyming things becomes much easier, which is how you wind up with extremely repetitive rhyme schemes. In English, we have a language that can be cheerfully described as three angry language raccoons sharing a raincoat. And that means that, so few things in English rhyme by comparison with, say, Italian or Latin or, one would assume, Greek. So they didn't really like rhyming because it felt cheap to them, which, I get it. But anyways, so we have this development in Greek art where they start off with the usual stuff that we in the arts would view as primitive, and then the Greeks develop culturally enough, technologically enough, and in terms of providing enough both wealth and free time for leisure travel, that they start to go, oh yes, I forgot I put this in, Greek architecture. Look at that. This is made by people who don't have pneumatics, they don't have electronics, they don't have modern gas-powered machines, they just have blood, sweat, tears, and, pulleys and things. So, you build something like that, think about that scale, and having to do that all without the advantage of, anything but muscle power. Anyways, so they come to Egypt, and they see this, and the thing about Egypt is that Egypt, it's an ancient culture, it absolutely predates the Greeks, and they have a lot of art in Egypt, they have a lot of sculpture, they have a lot of things that are taking those steps out of the abstraction that you get with quote-unquote primitive art, where you are using the art to express concepts folded in with representation. So it's the kind of thing that you get in medieval art, which is, to many people's way of thinking, a primitive form of art, where in a medieval artwork you would have a painting where Jesus is bigger than everything else because he's the most important thing. That, if you look at a Renaissance painting, Jesus is about the same size as everybody else because he's a guy, he's a human guy. So he's not going to be 50 feet tall by comparison with everyone else. But in a medieval painting, he's going to be much, much, much bigger. And that, you don't have perspective in medieval paintings. And you get that sort of thing. The more quote unquote primitive you are doing your art, the more you are going to abstract things. So you have Egypt, though, where they're taking these steps into making naturalistic representation, things that look kind of like the thing that they're supposed to be, something where you marvel at it and say, wow, that looks real. And in Greece, they start by imitating that. And you get these statues that are stiff, that are an imitation of these Egyptian forebears, but eventually they start to look more natural. They start to look more real. You look at this, and this is a century after the last one, and suddenly you have that looks like an actual human person that might physically exist in the world. Okay, well, he's lacking arms and feet, but you know what I'm saying. And then you get even more natural. Because now you have somebody who looks like a person who's actually standing, who looks like somebody who you could could step out and be a real person. The body more than the face, because at this point in time, the Greeks are still focusing very, very hard on idealized forms, because there are lines of thought in art that you should show the idealized forms, very Platonic, in terms of Plato's notion of the ideal, of the perfect, of the ultimate perfection that exists somewhere out there in, the multiple realities of whatever, that somewhere out there is an ideal rose that is the essence of all that makes up a rose, and so on and so forth. And they're aiming to draw people like that, or rather sculpt, because what we have here is sculpture. But you look at this and we're still in the idealized forms, and suddenly it's not stiff anymore. Look at this and look at the sheer unadulterated skill that goes into making something like this. Again, this is all being done by hand. There are no machines, there's no electric drills, there's no little polishing thing. This is all just, blood, sweat, and tears. And it's gorgeous and it's idealized. But now you look at the face, even from this sideways angle that we see it, and that is a person's face. That's not sort of a head that's grafted onto a carefully idealized body. Yes, it's an idealized face, but it's idealized and still looks like an actual person. And then they took the next step, representational art that looks like the person that they're imitating. This is a portrait of an actual Stoic philosopher. That is a philosopher of the Stoic philosophy of thought and so on. Very popular with the Romans. And you look at him, this isn't somebody idealized. He doesn't have a perfect muscular body. He isn't youthful. This is an older man, and he's kind of skinny, and he's wearing just kind of like a wrapped cloaky thing and unfortunate looking sandals. But that's a real person. That's probably exactly what this guy looked like. And so we have this arc, and it's an arc that is representative of the building out of Greek thought. And it's something that culminates in, you look at this is Baroque. This is something that wouldn't be out of place in 1600s in Italy. Because look at this, it's dynamic and full of movement. And yes, I studied art history at university, and so this is my thing. And eventually they got dark and they got cynical, and we start to get what is effectively abstract expressionism. Semi-abstract expression. This is pretty much expressionism before abstraction. The point is, you can see this arc in Greek thought and look at it, consider this in concert with philosophy, with acting, with plays, with all of these things, and how that would have impacted everybody else around them as you have this. And I'm running out of time, so I guess we're just not going to talk anymore about it, because that's everything. And yeah, I'm going to see you all next week.